The sound came first, a click, then static, then my father's voice, older than I remembered, steadier than it should have been. Everything goes to Matthew. Eleanor chose to leave. That was all. No explanation, no room left open. The words hung in the air like dust after something heavy hit the floor. I watched a woman at the far end of the table stop chewing. A man near the window shifted his weight and set his glass down too hard. Someone's phone buzzed once, then went silent. I stayed still, hands folded, fingertips pressed together just enough to feel the pulse there. Matthew stood by the speaker, one hand resting on the back of his chair. He didn't look at me. He didn't have to. He looked around the room instead, slow and satisfied, letting the sentence settle into people the way news always does when it finally confirms what they were hoping for. My mother moved next. She slid a thin stack of papers across the table, careful not to wrinkle the corners. The pen followed. Blue ink. Medium point. The kind she always bought in bulk. The title faced me. Waiver of Inheritance Interest. Her bracelet caught the light when she pulled her hand back. It chimed softly. I noticed because no one was speaking yet. It's just paperwork, she said, eyes fixed on the page. Not on me. This keeps things clean. Matthew leaned forward, then forearms on the table shoulders relaxed. The smile he wore was the same one he used with bankers and neighbors. Calm, certain, already counting the next move. Sign it now, he said. A pause. Or we'll make this ugly. I didn't reach for the pen. I didn't push the papers away either. I let them sit there between us untouched, like a test no one expected me to question. The clock on the wall ticked. Once, twice. Outside wind rolled off the lake and rattled the windows. I could hear someone breathing too fast behind me. I looked at my father. He was studying the grain in the table, tracing a dark knot with his eyes, as if it had suddenly become important. I asked one question, quiet, even. Dad, was that recording made before or after Aunt Ruth got sick? The room changed. My mother's hand froze mid-reach. Matthew's smile slipped just for a second before he caught it. A chair scraped back sharply, then stopped. No one answered. The speaker clicked as someone bumped the table. The clock kept ticking, and in that silence I understood something simple and final. They hadn't expected me to remember the timing. Before we continue, if you're enjoying this story, please hit the subscribe button and tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. I read every single comment, and it truly means the world to me. Thank you for being here. Now back to the story. The silence from that room followed me into memory. It always does. When I think back on that afternoon, my mind doesn't rush forward. It moves backward first to the image everyone else held of us before a single word was spoken. The version of our family that lived outside that house, polished and repeatable, the one people nodded at with approval. From the road, our place looked like a postcard. Weathered wood-wide porch, the lake stretched out behind it like it had agreed to behave. In summer, the light came in low through the pines and caught on the water just before sunset. You could hear boat engines, far-off laughter drifting in from neighbors' docks, the clink of ice and glasses when someone shifted their weight. We hosted gatherings that ran long without feeling loud. Folding chairs in neat rows, tablecloths pressed flat, nothing out of place. On Sundays, we sat in the same pew, third from the front. My father's hand always rested on the hymn book even when he wasn't singing. My mother kept a mint in her purse and offered it to anyone who leaned too close during the sermon. People noticed things like that. They called it character. They called us steady. Matthew fit that picture easily. He shook hands after service and remembered names. He carried casserole dishes without being asked. He spoke just long enough to sound thoughtful, never long enough to invite questions. Watching him, you'd think some people were born knowing exactly how to stand in good light. I stood a little off to the side in those moments. Not pushed away, just not centered. I learned to pour coffee without spilling to clear plates before anyone asked. Small movements that keep a room running without drawing attention to themselves. It wasn't painful, it was instructional. You notice patterns when you aren't the focus. There were rules even then. They weren't written. They didn't need to be. Praise moved in one direction. Doubt stayed quiet. When someone asked about a missing receipt or a late repair, the answer came smooth and confident, followed by a change of subject. People accepted that. Respect has a way of filling in gaps when it's been rehearsed long enough. What the town never saw were the pauses after the doors closed, the way conversations ended mid-sentence when certain topics came up, the look my mother gave when a question lasted half a second too long, the way my father folded papers twice before putting them away as if order itself could prevent problems from forming. I noticed those things. I stored them without naming them. At the time, they felt like manners. Years later, they read differently. By the time we reached the inheritance meeting, everyone believed they knew who we were. A family built on values, on tradition, on doing things the right way. That belief sat in the room with us heavy and unquestioned, and that was the most useful thing Matthew had going for him. Because when respect goes unchallenged long enough, it starts doing the lying for you. That belief carried Matthew. It always had. Once a family earns a reputation, someone gets to spend it. In ours, that someone was him. I saw it most clearly when the rentals became his responsibility, a phrase my father said with pride like it was a promotion instead of a blindfold. On paper, everything looked fine. Rent came in, repairs went out, the folders stayed neat. But when I visited, I noticed small things that didn't match the story. A new watch on Matthew's wrist one month, a truck upgrade the next. He'd joke about timing, about good deals falling into his lap. He'd tap the table with a pen while he talked fast, impatient, like details were beneath him. Tenants started adjusting how they spoke around him. I saw it in their shoulders when he walked up, heard it in the way they lowered their voices. Some agreements never made it past a handshake. "It's easier this way," he'd say, leaning in, smiling. "No paperwork, no trail. Just trust, the kind people give when they're afraid of losing a roof." When complaints did arrive, they landed softly and disappeared. I watched my mother open emails at the kitchen counter, sunlight catching the screen, her thumb already moving. Delete, delete. She didn't read past the subject line. "They always exaggerate," she'd say, turning back to her coffee. My father nodded without looking up, eyes fixed on the morning paper, as if silence itself could settle accounts. I didn't argue. I didn't interrupt. I noticed. I noticed the envelopes Matthew kept separate, the receipts that were photocopies of photocopies, the way repair invoices rounded numbers up instead of down, small edges smoothed over until they looked intentional. At night, when the house went quiet, I'd sit on the porch and listen to the lake slap against the dock. The sound was steady, honest. It didn't change its rhythm to impress anyone. I remember thinking how different that was from the conversations inside. The first real crack came from a voice that didn't belong to the family meetings. It came from someone who stood in hallways and waited for answers that never arrived. Someone who paid on time and still felt disposable. The message was short, careful, written like it might be read by the wrong person. "Please don't tell them I said anything," it began. I read it twice, then a third time. The words weren't dramatic. They didn't need to be. Dates, amounts, a promise that had been made and quietly changed. I felt my fingers tighten around the phone just enough to leave a mark. I didn't reply right away. I saved it. More followed. Not many, just enough. Each one lined up with something I'd already noticed. A missing repair. A rent increase explained one way applied another. Verbal agreements that somehow only benefited one side. Patterns don't announce themselves. They repeat until someone stops pretending not to see them. I brought it to my parents once. Carefully. Printed. Highlighted. My mother skimmed the first page, then closed the folder. My father pushed it back across the table with 2 fingers like it was hot. "Matthew's handling it," he said. "We trust him." That was the rule. Trust moved upward. Doubt stayed down. I didn't push. I filed the pages away. I learned who spoke and who stayed quiet. And I learned the most important part of the system. Matthew never had to explain himself, because as long as no one forced the truth into the light, respect would keep doing the covering. By the time I stopped trying to be heard, leaving felt less like a decision and more like a correction. Nothing dramatic marked it, no argument, no slammed doors, just a quiet narrowing of options until one path stayed open and everything else closed on its own. I packed at night, one lamp on, the house breathing around me the way it always had. I folded clothes into a suitcase that still smelled faintly of lake water and old paper. The floor creaked once under my heel. No one came to check. I paused at the doorway longer than necessary, listening for footsteps that never came. The drive started before dawn and ended after dark. Snow came down thick and steady once I crossed the state line, the kind that eats sound and turns the road into a narrow tunnel of light. My headlights cut two pale lines through it. The radio stayed off. I gripped the wheel harder than I needed to knuckles, pale breath slow. Mile markers passed like quiet witnesses. No goodbye calls came in. Not from my parents, not from Matthew. The phone stayed dark on the passenger seat screen, catching flashes of passing headlights. I noticed how quickly that stopped surprising me. Madison greeted me with clean sidewalks and buildings that didn't know my name. I rented a small place with thin walls and a radiator that knocked all night. It wasn't charming. It was functional. I slept better than I had in years. The job came through a listing I almost skipped. Junior property analyst, entry level, numbers heavy, quiet work. I learned quickly that properties tell the truth if you let them. Leases don't care about reputation. Ledgers don't respond to charm. They line up or they don't. I spent my days in rooms that smelled like paper and burnt coffee screens glowing pale against winter light. I learned how to read a balance sheet the way some people read faces. Where to look first. Where people hide things when they think no one will check. How a missing signature can matter more than a missing zero. At night, I printed documents and spread them across my kitchen table. Deeds, trust summaries, county records pulled from public databases. I traced ownership back like a map finger, moving slowly, stopping when something didn't make sense. I didn't rush. I didn't need to. Time was finally on my side. There were moments, small and sharp, when the old reflex kicked in. When I reached for the phone without realizing it. When I imagined explaining what I was learning, laying it out clean and simple the way I always had. Those moments passed. I learned to let them. Winter stretched on. Snow piled up against the windows. The city stayed quiet. In that quiet, something settled in me. Not anger, clarity. The understanding that systems don't fail people by accident. They do it by design, and they protect those who understand how they work. I advanced faster than expected. Not because I pushed, because I paid attention. I asked the questions other people avoided. I saved copies. I kept timelines. When something didn't add up, I marked it and moved on, trusting the pattern would finish the sentence later. By spring, I could spot a problem from across a spreadsheet. By summer, I knew which documents mattered and which ones were just noise. I learned that preparation isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself. It waits. The last thing I did before I stopped looking back was open a new folder on my laptop. Plain title, no dates, no names, just a place to put things that might matter someday. I didn't know then when I would need it, only that I would. That folder on my laptop didn't stay empty for long. I added to it slowly at first, the way you do when you're not sure yet what you're building. Then one evening just after dinner, my phone rang with a number I hadn't seen in years. No name attached, just a local area code from back home. Aunt Ruth didn't waste words. She never had. "Are you somewhere you can write things down?" she asked. I could hear a clock ticking behind her voice, steady and loud like it was keeping her honest. I closed my laptop, then opened it again, the screen lighting up the kitchen. "I'm ready," I said. She'd been the family accountant back when the work was still small enough to fit in a file cabinet. Careful, precise. The kind of person who balanced accounts with a pencil sharpened to a needle. Over time, she'd been labeled difficult. Too many questions. Too many notes in the margins. Eventually, they stopped asking her to look at things. She never stopped looking. "I started noticing gaps," she said. Not accusations, just gaps. Rent that cleared the bank but didn't land where it should. Transfers that took a scenic route before arriving. A company name she didn't recognize showing up once, then again, then regularly. She spelled it out slowly while I typed my fingers, keeping pace with her voice. It was a shell. Cleanly set up, minimal paperwork. A name close enough to one of the real vendors to pass a glance test. Money moved into it and then out again, thinner each time. Management fees, she said, and I could hear the quotation marks in her tone. Emergency repairs, consulting. I pictured Matthew's watch, the truck, the jokes about timing, None of it felt new, it felt confirmed. She didn't confront my parents. She told me that plainly, like a decision she'd already tested. "They won't hear it," she said. "They'll protect the story, not the truth." I watched the cursor blink at the end of a line and knew she was right. Instead, she printed everything: bank statements, transfer logs, articles of incorporation pulled from the state database. She circled dates with a red pen, slow and deliberate. When something didn't line up, she wrote a question mark and moved on. No commentary, just evidence. The papers lived in a box under her bed. She told me that too, wrapped in a plastic sleeve away from light, in case she said and didn't finish the sentence. I could hear her shift in her chair, the faint scrape of wood on tile. "What do you want me to do?" I asked. It came out quieter than I expected. "Nothing," she said. "Not yet." Then a pause. "Just don't lose this." She emailed scans that night. The files came through one by one, timestamps stacking up in my inbox. I opened them slowly, zooming in on signatures, on routing numbers, on dates that matched my own notes. The patterns locked together without effort, like they'd been waiting for each other. I didn't reply right away. I printed everything first, laid it out on my table, smoothed the pages flat with the side of my hand. The radiator clicked on and off. Outside, a car passed, tires hissing on wet pavement. Aunt Ruth called again the next morning. Her voice was steady. "I'm not asking you to fix anything," she said. "I'm asking you to remember who touched what and when." I told her I would. When the call ended, I added one more subfolder, labeled it with her name. Not as credit, as context. Some truths don't need a witness in the room, they just need someone who didn't look away. Aunt Ruth's scans didn't tell a story on their own. They waited. I printed them and laid them out in rows across my table, the way she would have edges squared, nothing overlapping. Morning light came in thin through the blinds, catching on staples and paper clips. The radiator ticked once, then went quiet. I started with dates, then amounts, then the space between them. That's where the truth usually sits. Transfers arrived whole and left lighter. Fees appeared twice. Repairs showed up without addresses. I circled entries with a pencil and felt the wood grain under my thumb as I pressed too hard. By the third pass, the total stopped being a guess. It settled, just over $300,000, spread out enough to feel invisible, concentrated enough to be deliberate. I wrote the number at the top of a yellow pad and underlined it once. No flourish, no math left to argue with. The signatures came next. Not the obvious ones. The small ones at the bottom of approval pages, initialed where people assume no one will look. I compared them to older files, leases from years back, bank forms my father had signed when the properties were first bundled. The slant was wrong, the pressure uneven. Someone had traced familiarity without earning it. Invoices told the rest. Emergency roof repair, foundation inspection, names of companies that existed only long enough to invoice and vanish. I checked addresses against county maps, lots with no structures, buildings that had burned down years earlier. One invoice listed a unit number that had never been built. I drew a line through it and kept going. I didn't feel angry, I felt focused. That surprised me. My breathing stayed even, my coffee went cold, untouched. I worked the way I'd learned to work, slow enough to be accurate, fast enough to keep momentum. Evidence likes a steady hand. When I stacked the papers, the pile leaned. I squared it again. On the top page, I clipped a photo Aunt Ruth had included as an afterthought, a marina receipt, time-stamped amount circled in blue. Deposit, large, clean. I recognized the number before I checked it against my pad. It matched. The boat came into focus without needing to be named. I'd seen it once, months earlier, tied up with a bowline too new for the dock. White hull, chrome fittings, the kind of purchase people call an investment when they want permission. The receipt date landed 2 days after a transfer labeled consulting. I set the receipt beside the ledger. The room felt smaller. Outside, a delivery truck idled, then pulled away. Somewhere, a neighbor slammed a door. Life kept its schedule. I opened my laptop and created a timeline. Not a narrative, a sequence. Dates on the left, actions on the right, transfers in black, invoices in red, signatures flagged with a star. By the end, it read like instructions rather than accusations. I sent one email. Short. Attached files only, no commentary. The subject line was a date. Aunt Ruth replied an hour later with a single sentence. That's what I saw. I closed the laptop and sat back. My chair creaked. I rolled my shoulders once and felt a tightness ease. Not relief, readiness. There's a difference. That night, I put everything into a fireproof folder and labeled it with a strip of tape. I wrote the date range, not the amount. Amounts change, dates don't. Before I turned off the light, I added one last note in my own hand and slipped it inside the cover. Not for anyone else, for me. Money doesn't disappear. It moves until someone follows it all the way. The folder stayed closed for 3 days. I didn't rush it. Evidence needs a container, not a reaction. When I finally opened it again, I noticed how the edges of the paper had already softened, like they'd accepted where they belonged. I slid the ledger beneath the bank statements and set the marina receipt on top. Order matters when you plan to be believed. Aunt Ruth asked me to come by on a Tuesday morning. No explanation, just a time. Her house smelled like lemon cleaner and old books, the kind of order that comes from habit, not performance. Sunlight fell across the dining table in a narrow strip, stopping just short of the chair she motioned me toward. She had already laid everything out. Not my folder, hers. A thicker stack bound with clips that had been bent and rebent over years. She didn't sit right away. She poured coffee, first steady hand, no spill. Then she looked at the wall clock and nodded once, like she'd been waiting for it to say something back. "I'm not fixing this," she said. "I'm closing it." The words landed clean. She explained the structure without raising her voice. An irrevocable living trust, private, tight, built to move quietly. There was a clause I hadn't seen before typed plain and direct: any documented fraud against the properties triggered immediate authority to the successor trustee. No debate, no delay, no family vote. I listened. I asked 2 questions. Not about fairness, about timing. She slid the draft across the table. The paper was warm from the printer. My name sat where it should have spelled correctly, no middle initial. Sole successor trustee. The language was precise enough to feel impersonal. That's how you want it. Outside, a truck passed. Inside, the clock ticked. Once, twice. We signed at 7:12 a.m. The pen felt heavier than usual. I pressed harder than I needed to felt the paper give. Aunt Ruth's signature came next, firm and practiced the way you write when you expect someone to check. The notary stamped the seal, biting into the page with a soft crunch. The clock skipped a beat. Just one. Then it kept going. No ceremony followed. No call to my parents. No warning to Matthew. The documents went into a manila envelope, then into a locked drawer. Ownership transferred the way it's supposed to through filings, timestamps, and silence. By noon, the county record reflected a change no one was watching for. 2 days later, Aunt Ruth was admitted for observation. Nothing dramatic, just enough to slow her down. I sat by her bed and watched the monitor rise and fall. The room hummed. A nurse adjusted a line and moved on. The envelope stayed in the drawer at home untouched. She squeezed my hand once before I left. Not reassurance. Confirmation. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt aligned. There's a difference between winning and positioning yourself so the truth can't be moved. I went back to my routine. Work, groceries, evenings quiet enough to hear the refrigerator kick on. I added one more page to my timeline, a single entry, date, time, filing number. I didn't annotate it. When people talk about surprises, they imagine noise, raised voices, sudden reveals. This one happened without a sound. By the time anyone thought to look, the door had already closed. The request came wrapped in courtesy. A phone call first. My mother's voice, careful paced, asking if I could stop by for coffee. She chose the time, mid-morning, when the light made the kitchen look forgiving. I arrived early. The house smelled the same, lemon cleaner, toast, familiar enough to lower defenses if you let it. They were already seated when I walked in, papers stacked neatly at the center of the table. Not many, just enough to look reasonable. My father adjusted his glasses twice before speaking. Matthew stayed standing, leaning against the counter, arms crossed, watching me like he was waiting for a delayed reaction. "It's a formality," my mother said, sliding the packet forward. The motion was smooth, practiced. The top page faced me on purpose. Waiver. Signature line blank. Date left open like a courtesy. I read it once, then again. The language was broad, careful, designed to close doors without naming them. I noticed the margins first. Narrow, no room for notes. The pen sat exactly where a hand would fall if it reached without thinking. My father cleared his throat. This avoids confusion later, he said. You've built your own life. This keeps things simple. Matthew stepped in before I could respond. He lowered his voice, leaned closer like he was offering advice instead of pressure. No one will believe you over us, he said. Sign it. Let it go. I felt my jaw tighten. Just once. I let it pass. The room was quiet enough to hear the refrigerator hum. Sunlight moved across the table inch by inch. I folded my hands together and pressed my thumbs until I felt the edge of my nail. A small grounding thing. Something real. I stood up. The chair legs scraped softly against the tile. That sound landed heavier than any words. My mother reached out without looking, fingertips brushing the edge of the paper as if it might slide away on its own. My father's eyes flicked up then down again, already rehearsing what he'd say later. I didn't argue. I didn't explain. There was nothing new to add. I'm not signing anything, I said. The sentence was flat. Complete. Matthew laughed once. Short. Sharp. You're making this harder than it needs to be. I picked up my coat from the back of the chair. The fabric felt heavier than it should have. I noticed that too. When I reached the door, my mother spoke again, her voice breaking just enough to sound sincere. Don't walk out like this, she said. We're family. I paused. Not for long. Long enough to turn the word over in my head and set it back where it had always sat. I'll be in touch, I said. Outside, the air was colder than I expected. The wind cut across the driveway and rattled the bare branches. I stood there for a moment, keys in my hand, breathing slow until the tightness eased. Through the window, I could see Matthew gesturing, already explaining the outcome to them. They believed I'd folded, that I'd run out of options, that silence meant retreat. I drove away without looking back. At the first stoplight, my phone buzzed. A text from Matthew. Just 3 words. You'll regret this. I didn't respond. I turned the phone face down on the seat beside me and watched the light change. They thought the paper was the end of me. They didn't know it was already too late. The invitation arrived 2 weeks later. Thick cardstock, cream-colored, embossed letters you could feel with your thumb, a celebration of the Brooks family's future. No mention of what had happened at the kitchen table. No mention of the papers. Just a date, a time, and the assumption that things had resolved themselves. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. When the day came, I drove there anyway. The house was full before I stepped inside, suits near the windows, dresses that whispered when people walked, a table set up near the wall with brochures laid out in neat fans, glossy photos of properties I knew down to the cracked steps and loose railings. Someone had placed small name cards beside each stack as if order alone could turn optimism into fact. I recognized the bank reps by their posture, relaxed, observant, pens clipped neatly into jacket pockets. A couple of lawyers hovered nearby, smiling in that careful way that suggests familiarity without commitment. Tenants stood in small clusters, cups in hand, unsure why they'd been invited, but happy for the food. Matthew moved easily through the room, shaking hands, slapping backs, that same salesman smile fixed in place. He wore a suit that fit better than his last one. I noticed the watch again. Different band, same shine. My parents stayed close to him, orbiting without touching. My mother adjusted a centerpiece that didn't need adjusting. My father cleared his throat twice and said nothing. No one approached me. That felt intentional. When Matthew tapped his glass, the room responded right away. Conversations folded, chairs angled in, the sound carried clean. I just want to thank everyone for coming, he said, voice smooth, practiced. Today marks a new chapter. He gestured toward the brochures. All properties are now fully under my authority. We're streamlining operations, protecting the legacy. Applause rose fast. Confident. People like endings. They like being told when something is settled. I stayed where I was until the clapping peaked. Then I moved. The suitcase rolled quietly over the hardwood. The wheels made a soft, steady sound that cut through the noise without asking permission. Heads turned. Applause thinned, then stopped altogether. I set the case down in the open space at the center of the room. I didn't look at Matthew. I knelt and flipped the latches. The sound was sharp, final. Inside the folders stood upright, color-coded tabs labeled in my hand. No clutter, no loose pages. My father took a step forward. "What is this?" he asked, though his voice had already changed. I lifted the first document and laid it flat on the table nearest us. Then the next. Deeds. Trust certification. County filings with raised seals that caught the light. I placed them carefully, aligning corners, letting the details speak without help. A lawyer leaned in, adjusted his glasses. His fingers moved quickly now, scanning dates, tracing signatures, checking stamps. The bank rep beside him stopped smiling. Matthew laughed once too loud. "This is a misunderstanding," he said. "She's confused." The lawyer didn't look up. "These are recorded," he said. "All of them." The room went very still. I could hear ice melting in someone's glass. A tenant shifted his weight, eyes fixed on the table. "Ownership transferred months ago," the lawyer continued. "There is no authority to announce." My mother's hand went to her mouth. My father sat down hard, like his legs had given out without telling him first. I closed the suitcase and stood. I hadn't come to argue. I'd come to correct the record. The room didn't explode. It contracted. Sound fell inward like air pulled from a sealed space. Mr. Caldwell cleared his throat and asked for a chair. He didn't need permission. He set the trust on the table, squared it with the edge, and opened to a page already creased from careful use. The paper made a dry sound when he smoothed it. Everyone leaned in without meaning to. He read one sentence first. Slow, even. Upon execution and recording, all listed properties transfer immediately to the successor trustee. He paused, then looked up. That transfer occurred months ago. His finger tapped the date. Once. Mr. Brooks has no legal standing. Matthew spoke, then stopped. His mouth stayed open like the words had missed their cue. My mother's chair scraped back an inch. My father stared at the floor as if it had moved under him. No one argued the language. No one could. Ink has a way of ending conversations. A phone rang. Not loud, just close. One of the bank reps checked the screen, frowned, and stepped aside. He answered in a low voice, turned his body away, then nodded twice. When he returned, his smile was gone. "We'll need updated instructions," he said, eyes on me now. "Effective immediately." Vanessa had been standing very still near the window. I hadn't noticed her until she moved. She slid the ring off with her thumb, set it on the sill, and picked up her purse. The metal made a small final sound against the wood. She didn't look at Matthew when she left. The door closed softly behind her. Matthew tried again. He raised his voice this time, listing intentions like they were rights. Mr. Caldwell let him finish. Then he turned another page and read the clause no one expects to hear. Read aloud. Fraud trigger. Authority vested. Remedies enumerated. The words didn't accuse. They documented. Another phone buzzed. This one stayed where it was. Mr. Caldwell glanced at the screen, then back at Matthew. "You should speak with counsel," he said. "There's an inquiry." He didn't say the agency's name at first. He didn't need to. When he did, it landed heavy and plain. The party ended without anyone announcing it. People set down glasses. Brochures were gathered and stacked as if they'd always belonged in a drawer. Tenants clustered near the door, confused but calm, asking who to pay next month. I answered them. Names, dates, addresses, simple things. My parents called later. Then again, the house went on the market 30 days after that. The sign leaned a little to the left. I noticed when it sold. I didn't go to the closing. I kept the management the way I'd learned to keep records clean, visible, boring in the best way. Repairs got done where the buildings actually stood. Payments went where they were supposed to go. Tenants stayed. That was the point. Months passed, then a year. The lake froze and thawed and froze again. I sat on my balcony some nights and listened to traffic instead of water. The fireproof folder stayed on the shelf. I didn't open it often. I didn't need to. People ask what it felt like. They want a word that carries heat. I don't give them one. What I remember most is the sound of paper when it's read correctly, and how quickly certainty changes hands when dates and signatures line up. The law didn't raise its voice. It didn't have to.